Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our third Maine Data Center Advisory Council meeting. We're going to just give people a couple of minutes. It takes Zoom some time to add all of our attendees. We'll give people a second to join, get joined. Welcome all of you to our third Maine Data Center Advisory Council meeting. Today's meeting is going to focus on energy and energy issues related to large-scale data centers. Though we'll also do some recap of last meeting. I think we have 68 attendees right now and 19 panelists, which include our council members and staff and facilitators and guest speakers. I'm going to hand this over to Melanie to walk through our agenda and preliminaries for today's meeting.
Great. Thanks so much, Stacy. Thanks everybody for joining us today for our third meeting. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us, both for our council members and our listening audience. So this morning, what we're going to do is similar to what we've done for prior meetings, go over quickly the background for why we're all here and what our process is going to look like. I'll do a quick recap of our last meeting, which focused on environmental topics. And then we've got a great panel of presenters today to talk about topics focused on energy related issues associated with data centers. So we'll be hearing from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, our own Department of Energy Resources and Public Utilities Commission, and a representative of ISO New England. Then we will have an opportunity for the council to have some discussion, as well as receive some public input, and then we'll talk about what we're going to do next after this meeting. So as I said, we've covered this in our last two meetings, but just as a reminder, and for anyone who's new in our audience, in April of this year, Governor Mills signed an executive order that established the Maine Data Center Advisory Council to evaluate potential energy and environmental issues related to the development of large-scale data centers in Maine. The executive order charges this council with identifying ways to minimize environmental impacts, protect ratepayers, and maintain a reliable grid, and enable responsible economic development. And our final report is due to the governor and the legislature by January 29 of 2027. So here you can see this is the same workflow that we've shown before. It shows how we're going to be moving through this process to develop our final report, considering three key topics: environmental impacts, ratepayer and grid impacts, and economic and community development. For each of those topics, the council will evaluate existing safeguards, risks and opportunities, best practices, and policy considerations related, again, to large-scale data centers in the Maine context. We're going to be using our three summer meetings to provide background information and get into the substance of each of those three topics. And then we're going to be hearing from the public during two public listening sessions, which I'll describe a little bit more in a minute. And then this fall, we're going to dive more into discussion and work on formulating actionable recommendations to include in our report. So the council's work is going to be informed by public input throughout the entire process from start to finish. So as a reminder, there are several ways for members of the public to engage with the council. You can attend the public meetings like the one we're having right now and participate in the meeting polls. If you can't make it to a meeting, they're all recorded and posted on the Data Center Advisory Council's website. Please be sure to check out that webpage. Keep an eye on it for updates. There's a QR code here. You can also sign up for council emails and newsletters. So when there's new information that's posted on that webpage, you'll automatically receive notice of that. The public can also provide input through surveys, which have been giving us really helpful information. We are sharing those survey results in each of our meetings and then with more detail in the meeting summaries that we post afterwards. Just as a reminder, the energy survey went live this week and is going to be open through July 16th. So please make sure to take that survey if you haven't done so already. In our first kickoff survey, we asked members of the public to weigh in on which methods of public input worked best for them. So based on what we heard, we are planning to add 2 council meetings in August and September that will be listening sessions. These are intended for the council to be able to hear recommendations directly from the public about how to protect ratepayers, maintain grid reliability, minimize environmental impacts, and enable appropriate siting of data centers. And so we do hope that those of you who've been following our work will make sure to participate in those. And like all of our meetings, those listening sessions will also be recorded and posted online. And then also just to note, you can also check out the PUC docket and follow and engage with that process, which is happening separately but concurrently, using that docket number that we have here. Here you can see some summary statistics from our public engagement efforts to date. As I just described, we'll continue to seek public input throughout the council process, and we do expect to see these numbers climb over time, but we've had great participation so far. So far, we've conducted 3 stakeholder surveys that were open to the public, including the energy survey, again, which is still open. These surveys have generated a total of over 700 responses from people in all of Maine's counties and from more than 150 towns and municipalities across the state. In our first 2 meetings, we conducted 6 meeting polls with audience members to get feedback, and we shared the results live in those meetings. Those poll results are also detailed in the meeting summaries that are on our webpage. We're going to have a couple more of those polls in today's meeting, so I hope for those of you in the audience that you'll stick with us and participate in those. And throughout this process so far, we've had over 300 people tune in to our council Zoom meetings, so thank you all for joining us and participating, and then over 500 people who have signed up for our email newsletter. Ultimately, I want to thank everyone who has taken the time both to attend a meeting and respond to a survey. The input that you've provided really is critical to help guide the focus of the council's work and to really make this effort a success and meaningful to all of the people in Maine. So the second survey, which was sent out just before our June 23rd meeting, asked questions about environmental regulations that pertain to large-scale data centers. We received over 450 responses to that survey, which was really tremendous. And I'd like to thank folks who have been following this council for sharing that survey out through your networks. That has really worked at getting us a lot of great feedback. The key themes that came through in those survey responses aligned with much of what we covered in our last meeting. For water supply and private wells, we heard questions like, how will large cooling water withdrawals affect water bodies and water supplies, especially during times of drought? And are our water supplies adequately protected? We heard questions about land use, habitat, and wildlife impact. What are the impacts on wildlife habitat? And are our existing land use, zoning, and siting protections adequate? We've heard lots of questions and concerns about water quality and cooling water discharges. What water contaminants are produced by those cooling processes? Where do they go? And how will those discharges be monitored? For noise and light pollution from data centers, what will be the audible impacts and safeguards both during construction and operation of these facilities? And how will noise and light pollution be measured? And any limits that are established, how will those be enforced? We also heard questions about what impacts could data centers have on the health and quality of life of the surrounding residents? How will data centers avoid negative impacts to Maine's climate goals? And then also, what protections can we put in place now for when a data center closes, such as requirements for decommissioning? So again, this input was really helpful, and I think helped to guide both the work of the council during our discussion at our last meeting and also moving forward. So during our June 23rd meeting, I gave a crash course on environmental regulations that would apply to the construction, operation, and closure of data centers. In many ways, data centers are similar to other large commercial buildings, but they do have some different features that are largely connected to their need to cool electronic equipment. We've heard through the public input a lot of concern about water use and water contamination. And we heard from the national lab presenters about how those factors vary depending on the type of cooling technologies that are used at a facility. We covered how our existing regulatory framework addresses site construction, wetlands, habitat, water withdrawals, wastewater discharges, air emissions, noise, and wastes. Then we discussed how environmental impacts are different depending on the siting and the scale of a data center facility, and heard that clarifying the permitting processes for those facilities would likely benefit members of the public, local communities, and economic development. We also discussed the clear, specific requirements for noise, infrasound, water consumption, and cooling fluids could improve the effectiveness of our regulatory framework. So before we move on to a discussion of energy-related impacts, I would like to give the council members a brief opportunity if you'd like to share any more reflections that you have from our last meeting, and I'll turn it over to Stacy to facilitate that discussion.
Great. Thank you. Um, so RT, if you want to just take those slides down for a second, we can invite council members. Now that you've heard these themes recapped that we got from the public as their primary concerns, you've heard Melanie's key takeaways from what came from the last meeting. Just opening to your reflections. Do these sound right? Is there anything missing? Anything else you want to flag? Fighting your reflections, your thoughts. Anything that struck you? Melanie nailed it. Had it all.
Yep,
Seeing nodding. Go
I
ahead,
think it was
Brendan.
very consistent and clear feedback from the public and from the presenters, and so I think it's summarized well.
Great. Just to keep in mind, I think as we take this forward, the task will be to then sort of name where you see the potential policy prescriptions or recommendations that you want to take forward as a council on this. Um, is there any other information or questions or explorations you think would be helpful to keep in mind as the team is preparing for those preliminary policy conversations on environmental issues? Do people all feel like you have a good handle on what we need to do?
I mean, I
Maybe
would
we,
say it was sort of clear from, I think, Melody's presentation that there are a lot of different opportunities for DP to oversee various components of the data center. So I think as we think about moving forward, we want to make sure if we're addressing gaps, they're truly gaps, and that we're not adding more layers of complexity.
yeah, thanks. I think that, that came up in the last meeting also of like just getting more clarity about what the process is that would really benefit both the communities so that they really know what the process looks like, but also any developers. And that would include, yeah, not adding new layers. Helpful. Anything else people want to name now?
Stacy, I would echo that. Uh, I would echo that need and sentiment of clarifying points of overlap, increasing access and transparency of how those existing processes are related to each other. And I think we've started to unearth those well. And I think the presentation last session set a really good overview of a framework to build from.
Great. Thanks, Andrew.
I think one thing I might add, and as really the presentation was fantastic, and I think really does did a good job of laying out all of the existing authorities and responsibilities that DEP has for permitting all kinds of different things. I think we're still thinking through, along with some of our other environmental partners, like are there places that are um, to look at that are specific to data centers? Because we do have um, precedent for some, sector industry specific rules with, for example, the mining law. Whether an approach like that is appropriate for data centers, I think we're still thinking through. And but but if that's the case, I think, it is something that we should definitely explore. So
Yeah, great. Thanks. And I think, that came up, particularly around things like noise, and, maybe light, things like that. But Jack, are there other things you have in mind now?
no, nothing that I would say at the moment. I mean, I think the other thing that we're obviously thinking about is making sure that we're considering all of the significant rollbacks in federal environmental protections. There was just a recent story that I can dig up a link to and find around wetlands, federal wetlands protections. Again, need to do the cross-referencing to see what the state is, but the federal rules basically, if it's not a navigable waterway, it's no longer protected under the Clean Water Act, generally speaking. And so that we want to make sure that we're not leaving ourselves, is there a gap that the state might need to fill because the federal government is sort of giving up their responsibility to protect environmental quality.
Thanks for bringing that up, Jack. And I think that's a good one for us to make sure that we feel comfortable that we have coverage. I just say for everybody that the state of Maine has a provision that refers to waters of the state. And so, over time, the federal government has changed their definition of what we call WOTUS, waters of the US. And it's kind of ping-ponged all over the place. But we've remained consistent with our definition of waters of the state, which is an extremely broad reading of what would be covered in terms of potential wetlands impacts. So it does affect where, at the federal level, when they change the definition for WOTUS, it affects what Army Corps would cover, but it doesn't change what we would cover at the state level. So despite whatever they do at the federal level, we've continued to have a really broad reach to cover our own waters.
Great. Thanks for that, Melanie.
Yeah, and thank goodness, and thank you, Melanie.
All right. Great. Well, let's move on to today's topic of energy. We will come back, as we've said, to environment when we look at the big picture of all the areas. I want to, before we begin our presentations, I want to just review some of the preliminary things we've heard from the energy survey that just went out at the beginning of the week. So we already have gotten 49 responses to that survey. And here's some of the initial themes. We heard about energy cost and rate allocation, questions like who pays for increased demand, how it will affect the already high cost of electricity, whether and how the state should require data centers to cover their own costs to make sure ratepayers are protected. We heard about capacity, reliability, and supply, to make sure that existing infrastructure is able to absorb the load of large data centers without reducing reliability for other users. How exactly they're going to increase that capacity, and the range of tools that might be available that can help avoid worsening demand, particularly at peak times. A lot of questions about regulatory oversight, about how to make sure that that we have all the right regulations to make, and the rules that will will govern data centers and large data center power access on the emission side and self-generation side as well. And then a number of comments about clean energy to make sure that there's nothing that is going to undermine Maine's movement toward clean energy and climate goals. And then lastly, questions about measurement and transparency and accountability. There were some other comments that were outside of the topic of energy. We're not listing them here, but we are capturing them and putting them into the right categories for when we get to those sections. So I think you're going to hear that a lot of these topics are covered in today's presentations. These survey results really do help shape those presentations. The survey it remains open. So we hope that people will continue to answer it, and we will update these themes and these results both in the meeting summary and in our recap at the next meeting. The other thing that the survey asked was just an initial ranking of how important are each of these issues. And you can see that rate impacts were really marked as the highest important. Market impacts were also important. And then power sourcing, infrastructure cost allocation, reliability were also quite important. People also did care about emergency protocols. So those are some of the initial things that we've heard from the public. And as I said, that will be updated as we go along. I'm going to hand this over now to Selena to overview our presentations and speakers for today.
Great. Thank you, Stacy. Good morning, everyone. I'm Selena Cunningham, Acting Commissioner of the Maine Department of Energy Resources. It's great to see the council members as well as so many members of the public join us today. So as we jump into the energy conversation today, we're going to focus on energy impacts associated with large-scale data center development in Maine. For this portion of the meeting, we'll have panel presentations from multiple subject matter experts who will speak to different aspects of energy as it relates to large-scale data centers. Following the presentations, we will have a live meeting poll for the public to gather input and questions, and time for robust council member discussion. And the presenters will be available to answer questions as well. So in addition to the environmental considerations we've discussed, as you see from the initial survey results and from our discussions to date, while we have not seen significant large-scale data center growth in the state or region, there are substantial concerns around that prospect of an increase in energy costs to Maine people due to large data centers, as well as concerns around overall system reliability and implications for our clean energy goals and statutory obligations. It is also worth considering that there are potential benefits from more strategically using the existing infrastructure we have already invested in. Maine's energy system has a complex structure involving a number of different entities that regulate, oversee, administer, or are otherwise involved in the energy system. In Maine and New England, the transmission and distribution infrastructure, meaning the poles and wires and substations on the electric side, and pipelines and compressor stations and the like on the gas side, are regulated with both state and federal jurisdiction over different components. The regulatory bodies are primarily the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, and the Maine Public Utilities Commission, or Maine PUC. Energy supply, whether it's electricity or gas, is a competitive market with many potential suppliers competing in the marketplace. There are state laws and regulations that apply, including everything from air emission standards that we heard about during the last meeting, to consumer protection requirements, to state energy policies like the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard, which I'll speak more about shortly. With electricity, there are wholesale markets for multiple products, all of which are administered by ISO New England, the nonprofit entity overseen by FERC. Today, we'll have 4 panel presentations that will provide an introduction to key elements of how these energy systems work and how they intersect with potential large data center development in Maine and in the region. First, we'll hear from Ian Hoffman from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, who will ground us in how different types of data centers use energy, and he'll share some observations about data center interest in Maine and in New England. Next, I'll provide an overview of electricity costs in Maine, how those are managed, trends over time regarding energy usage, opportunities for more efficiently using the system we have already built, and potential areas for additional safeguards. Third, we'll hear from Chair Bartlett of the Maine PUC, covering its authorities and ongoing work related to large data centers, including the docket mentioned earlier today. Lastly, we'll hear from Melissa Winnie from ISO New England, entity responsible for key system planning and bulk power system operations across the 6 New England states. Melissa will speak to how data centers and other large loads are factored into their work. Finally, I want to acknowledge the critical roles and perspectives of state consumer advocates that engage in these areas, in each of these arenas. And we're grateful to have Maine Public Advocate Heather Sanborn as a member of the council, and of the electric utilities themselves who provide service in Maine. Central Maine Power, represented by Craig Nail, Versant Power by Erica Young, and municipal and cooperative utilities represented by Amy Turner. We have substantial time in today's agenda for dialogue among council members, and I'm looking forward to each of you sharing your expertise and perspectives. And with that, Ian Hoffman from Lawrence Berkeley Labs, I'll turn it to you.
Oh, thank you. Let's see. Are you showing slides on your, there we go. Thank you. Go ahead to the first slide if you would. Thanks. So it's a pleasure talking to you today. It sounds like you're going to hear a lot about power-related issues. I just saw the survey results, and if there's anything that I can address on there afterwards, hopefully, please don't hesitate to bring it up during the Q&A. So I'm here to talk about kind of what's going on nationally with the data center build out and what its energy impacts are. And specifically, and these are some of the questions from staff. Where does Maine fit into this national context? What are the trends for data centers in New England broadly? We're also going to talk about what the specific power needs of different types of data centers are like, say for AI versus traditional data center. And we're going to touch a little bit on demand flexibility, which in some states is now becoming kind of part and parcel of their regulatory approach to interconnection of data centers on the grid. I think the question I hope to answer is can they reduce loads when there's strain on the grid? And the answer is yes, they can. We'll talk about that a little bit, and as well as touching on the relationship between data center energy and water use. Please, next slide. So Congress has tasked Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory over the years to model and estimate data center energy use starting well before the advent of AI. Our energy analysis team generates the government's official estimates of data center energy use. And the latest report from that team just came out 2 weeks ago based upon chip shipments. It's a bottom-up model. It starts from the chips and moves up from there. And this latest update is based upon shipment data kind of towards the end of 2025. And in the latest reference case, I know it's a busy slide, a busy chart, but that bluish green curve there depicts the latest projections through 2030. And what you'll see there is that they're projecting that the growth in medium and large data centers will continue and more than double electricity use in the sector to nearly 12% of total U.S. electricity use. For power, the analysis projects that data centers will need 148 gigawatts of power in 2030. That's an average annual capacity increase, 17.4 gigawatts per year. It's from the period of 2024 through 2030. They use 2024 as a baseline just because there was not a full year of shipment data available at the time that the report was originally when the report data was frozen for 2025. Anyway, so that level of increase, that's roughly a third of the total national anticipated increase in demand, according to FERC's latest reporting. So to put that in perspective, the summer peak power demanded by New York City, that's Manhattan and the other boroughs, is about 11 gigawatts. The data center industry right now is building in power terms about a New York City and a half every year for the next few years, with gigawatt scale campuses under construction in multiple locations from Wisconsin to Louisiana, Texas to Utah. Next slide, please. So that's the national picture. The picture is a little different in New England, and to get a sense, if you'll glance at that legend that's at left, you'll see a lot of different data center types. We'll discuss them in a moment. But so far, what you're not seeing are the most on the map are the most vibrant colors, not much of them anyway. The reds, the oranges that denote the really big data center types are not really there in New England. Most of the data center build out in New England has been data centers that are kind of in the tens of megawatts that are leased facilities, leased to single tenants. So, a big tech company will take a lease on a facility. Often those are like 15-year leases, renewable. And then there are also some when you see these purple rings on there, those are powered shells. Somebody's gone out and built the outside shell, but and secured power for it, but there's no equipment inside. It's not operating. Lastly, there are a number in green there. You'll see crypto mining facilities, and nearly overwhelmingly, most of that computing is in Massachusetts. Maine has 3 or 4 mid-sized data centers, kind of on the lower end of that spectrum, and also not reflected on this map. It has a few dozen smaller ones we can talk about a little bit later. New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Vermont, they all have less in terms of total computing capacity. But kind of for comparison, looking at the region, you could add up all of the computing in terms of middle and large scale data centers for the entirety of Northeast, plus New York, plus New Jersey, and it would still be less than what you see in Pennsylvania. And you could add up all of those plus Pennsylvania, and it would be less than the hundreds of large data centers that are crowded into the northernmost tip of Virginia. I think folks are interested in kind of where else is the build out occurring. And so it's in Texas in a very big way. They're home to the very first gigawatt scale campuses. And they're expecting right now that their power requirements are going to be equal to what the total power serving every other aspect of the economy is. Next up is the rest of the Southwest, Arizona, Utah, soon New Mexico, and then parts of the Midwest, and then the rest of the Southeast, especially Georgia and Louisiana, now home to the largest data center campus that's under construction. That's Hyperion, a campus that Meta's building down there at more than 7 gigawatts of capacity. So again, you're not really seeing that scale of development in the Northeast, and we'll talk about why, at least I think that is, and you'll we'll talk about that in just a second. If you could go to the next slide, please. So just, I think you got a primer in one of your last meetings on the different types of data centers. I'm not going to dwell here too long, but all of these collectively, these are kind of the cornerstones of the digital economy. You pick up a phone, you open your laptop, check your email, you're using a data center. And until a little over a decade ago, these enterprise data centers were where most of the work got done. And they're still around, thousands and thousands of them, probably a few dozen here in Maine, in your larger businesses, in government agencies. your hospitals, universities. They can be small, a few racks up to maybe about a half a football field of racks. All of it very low density in terms of compute here. So we're talking about single digits of kilowatts per rack, maybe up to 10 generally. Um, and by comparison, when we start talking about hyperscale facilities, we're talking about now hundreds, more than 100 kW per rack, and soon up around 250. Um, let's see. Uh, so again, low density computing equipment, it can be cooled by air and generally is. In enterprise facilities, it's pretty much all air cooling. Starting a little over a decade ago, new types of data centers kind of arrived on the scene, and they could do a lot of the work that those data centers were doing. The enterprise facilities much more inexpensively, and these included co-location facilities where you lease physical space inside of a building, and they put a cage around your racks, and it's your domain inside of that building. They supply power, they supply the cooling and other services, but you maintain your own racks, and but more importantly, you have hyperscale cloud providers, and that's where you're doing your computing in the cloud. A lot of hyperscale facilities originally built to provide cloud services now are providing AI training and hosting. And See, nearly all of these, when we talk about these gigawatt data centers, they're not really gigawatt scale facilities. They are campuses, and they're usually built in chunks. So like 50, 60 megawatts, maybe as much as 100. But when you hear about that, they're all broken up into data halls. And sometimes they will, on the same campus, have different functions in each of the halls or a mix of functions within those halls. There are more data center types that are just kind of coming on the scene. They include edge computing facilities, and these can be quite small. They're often close to telecom facilities or individual users are in industries that where they're being used for optimization. They're designed to be compact, very self-contained. Not many of them now, but there soon probably will be, and handling AI inference hosting. Lastly, there are a burgeoning number of these neo cloud facilities. So they host GPUs and they offer them as a service. You can rent them by the hour. So if you want to create your own model, you want to do experiments, you want to have them hosted for, their pricing is very competitive with the cloud providers, AWS, Google, Azure. There are other data center types, but let's go on to the next slide. So lots of different types of facilities, all of them use servers, and that's what we see here on your y-axis. You'll see that we're talking about the number of servers that are out there. And you can think of servers here as a proxy for two things: the digital work that has to be done, and the energy required to do that work. And so you can see that there's this tectonic shift a little over a decade ago from internal or enterprise data centers, kind of the stuff here that's in the brown and the pink and the red, to the hyperscale and colo or colocation market that's up here in blue and green. And that's the core of the digital economy today. And in part because of power hungry AI servers, if you remade this chart on the basis of energy, a lot more would be blue and green. By 2030, our projections are showing that AI servers will dominate the energy consumption across the entire community, that it'll count for about 55% of all data center energy use. Next slide, please. So what do these loads look like, and why are we looking at two time scales here? Because if you look at the hourly load traces for training an AI model, it looks pretty steady. It looks like a nice kind of squarish block, but if you peer down at the level of seconds and even lower, you'll see some huge power swings that are on the millisecond time scales. And things are changing way faster than the grid was built for. And we're going to talk about this just a touch more on the next slide. Loads are somewhat similar. It turns out that teaching a neural network and talking to it both require power intensive communications among lots of chips. But AI inference uses fewer chips and less of the total chip power in each one of them. And so the load is of a smaller magnitude, and it's largely diurnal. It follows kind of like enterprise and colo loads, it follows more or less business working hours. Can be noisy down at the server level at very small time scales, but the magnitude of the load again is fairly modest, and therefore its impact on the grid is a more modest than it is for AI training. Next slide, please. So what does this look like, at least for AI training? These two figures at the top are both AI training runs that are mapped down at thousandths of a second. And that's what it looks like when you have tens of thousands, increasingly now hundreds of thousands of chips all in sync, kind of vacuuming up data from the web or other sources, and they're performing some complex math on on that data, and then passing the information to neighboring chips, both forwards and backwards. And that's what's happening when you see these huge dips in here. That's um, that's what's happening. They're essentially stopping the calculations and passing it along, and then doing the next set of calculations. The different colors here you can kind of ignore. They what they correspond to are different efforts by industry to tame this effect, to tame these transients. And so you can see, there's software-based mitigation. There's things that you can do at the GPUs at the rack, and there's some storage, energy storage you can do at the rack that helps with this stuff. But the issue here for the grid is that because AI training, the frequency of these changes is kind of tends to concentrate demand around zero point 0.2 to 3 hertz, and that's really close to the resonance frequencies for turbine generator shafts and long transmission lines. There are some other power quality issues that we can discuss that arise from events involving multiple large data centers tripping offline. That's part of what's alarming FERC and NERC these days, and we can talk about that some more. But down at the single facility level, this is kind of the most significant issue that you would find out there. And this is a hyperscale training phenomenon. When you're talking about 20, 50 megawatt facilities, it's not really an issue. Next. So let's come back to Maine and where it kind of fits into this picture. Mostly the data center build out there happening now it is happening elsewhere, and that's because developers and operators need a lot of inexpensive power, land, and connectivity. I think Maine is making some strides in terms of advancing its broadband infrastructure. But it's nothing really like Northern Virginia, which is carrying something on the order of 70% of the world's data. You also we're the population here is in Maine is kind of rural and distant from major metro areas. Um, there are some data centers that developers want to be close to population. There are also some issues here in the Northeast with interconnection cost and the queues, and there are also some issues here with public acceptance. These folks are mindful that even just a month of delay that represents tens of millions in lost revenue, and just as a business interest, they tend to go where there's less resistance. Countering all that, Maine has some great advantages out there. It is a cold, wetter climate. That means less energy, and the temperature means there's less need for water use. And there it's a significant draw. But again, see power cost as the main kind of driver here. Um, you know, 6 of the 10 states with the highest rates are in New England. Maine is on the low end, but it's still more costly than power in Texas. Roland, next slide, please. So how much, actually, can you skip this Go to the next one. So how much data center growth could come to Maine? I don't want to venture a guess, but I will say that some researchers have tried to quantify what's happening at the state level based upon applying national scenarios. And here, right, you can see that EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, has ranked states by where the build out is and kind of what impact it would be expected to have on statewide load. And so the highest growth rate so at the highest growth rate, where data centers use 17% of the nation's electricity in 2030, if you'll look down, you'll see that Maine in that year is projected to have kind of less than 3% of its load occupied by, constituted by these medium and large facilities. So generally, what you're seeing are small and mid-sized facilities, often with mixed loads, less AI. Probably not big training clusters are on the horizon. Maybe some inference facilities, often gravitating to industrial sites. We'll talk in a moment about efforts to build generation on site and keep most of the cost of service with the data center owner and operator. Next slide, please. And so if you ask what can be done to manage potential impacts of data centers on the grid and on other customers, I have two colleagues that just released this guide a couple of weeks ago. It shows the many ways in which utilities, state regulators, and grid operators can manage the impacts of data centers on the grid. These are drawn from lessons from other states around the country that have been grappling with this, as well as some of the ideas that are bouncing around in academia and um, electric policy circles. And so what you'll see reflected here is that it identifies more than 40 different strategies for protecting the grid, for protecting other customers, while at the same time making it possible for some communities to maybe look to a data center to spread system cost over more sales and to garner more tax base to serve local needs. Next slide, please. So you're hearing today from real experts in utility rates and cost allocations. I'm not just going to leave it at this, that people have been looking for evidence that data centers are pushing up rates. And where they find it is really just limited to a part of the grid, to the PJM interconnection where data center load is most concentrated. It's not in the Northeast, at least not now. Where data centers are not showing up at scale, or where data centers are bringing their own generation or some other form of capacity here, maybe demand response, the upward pressure of rates is really coming from other places like grid modernization. At lower levels of build out, data centers actually can reduce costs by spreading those costs over more sales. I should note that Mainers are still likely to see some increase in other costs that are driven indirectly by the data center build out. That build out is creating powerful new demands in the economy for high-end electrical power equipment, for skilled labor, for many other things. And so you'll see some examples at right, but these facilities, like other industries, I mean, they require transformers and switchgear and on-site generators, and the cost and lead times for all of them are growing. Likewise, there's a huge need for experienced electrical engineers, project managers, even plumbers that are getting paid significantly more to bring these facilities online. Next slide. Just a few points here about demand centers and demand flexibility. The short version is they can do it. The opportunities to tamp down power demand exist from the computing software and hardware all the way up to the facility power and distribution and cooling systems to on-site generation. All of these facilities have backup generation, and increasingly that's clean, getting cleaner. And then traditionally it was diesel. Plus, every GPU that's out there can be and often is power capped. You can easily go in and lower those caps just with a few keystrokes, and it'll make your multi-month AI training run go on longer by a few hours or days, but that's pretty much the impact. And most AI inference jobs right now are running in highly networked cloud facilities, and they can be containerized, they can be moved, transferred to another data center in another region. So they're spatially flexible. You can run servers hotter for short periods of time as long as it's a slow ramp up and down so you don't warp the motherboard or the chip die. We can talk about this more during Q&A, what those opportunities for demand flexibility are if you like. Next slide, please. I think the last thing I want to convey is just about water use. It varies a lot among these facilities. When you hear someone say data centers use X million gallons a day, you should, be a little skeptical and ask, well, where is that? And what kind of cooling system is involved? Because it matters enormously. There can be a 10,000-fold difference in how much water is used based upon those two factors, climate and the configuration of the cooling system. And things are changing. The industry is moving away from evaporative cooling, where most of the on-site water use has been, and towards closed-loop cooling systems with dry coolers that release the heat ambiently, unless the outdoor air is really, really hot, and then they augment with some evaporative cooling. Moving to lower water use does raise a trade-off, though. Evaporative cooling uses more water on site, but is more energy efficient, lower impact on the grid. So that saves water on site. It saves water at the power plant. So we have site water use and source water use. And so the source water use footprint for data centers is actually more significant at the power plant. Dry cooling uses more energy, reduces water use on site, but increases it at the power plant. I understand, Maine's got an RPS. The more that you move away from thermal generation and towards renewables, water use is less of an issue offsite. So I think that's about it for me, and appreciate the chance to walk through this with you and look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you, Ian. So we are going to hold questions. As I mentioned in the chat, we're going to hold questions until after all of our presenters. So please do feel free to just jot them down. But let me turn this back to Selena.
Great. Thanks. That was very interesting. I look forward to discussion and questions people have about your presentation. Ian, thank you for that. Before we dive in, I want to briefly introduce the Department of Energy Resources, which is the cabinet level executive branch agency that leads energy policy for the state. And the department launched last year, replacing the governor's energy office with the support of Governor Mills and the Maine legislature. The department's policy responsibilities include energy planning, programs, regulations, and other initiatives. Today, I'm going to walk through the key components of our energy system and the components of our electricity costs, including energy supply and markets, where our energy comes from, and how market dynamics influence prices, and then take a look at trends and opportunities, including demand over time, grid utilization, and demand flexibility. I'll close with some policy considerations pertaining to energy and large data centers in Maine. Okay, so taking a look at what are the components of our electricity costs. To start at a high level, here is a simplified representation of the primary components of the electricity system. On the left, it starts with the generation that produces electricity. In New England, generators compete to sell electricity in the wholesale markets. Electricity is delivered from generators to customers via the grid, which has two major components. First, in the middle is the transmission system. This is the bulk power system, often compared to the interstate highway system, that moves large amounts of power along over long distances. You see this infrastructure around us in the dedicated utility corridors with the tallest poles and largest substations. Much of that power is then stepped down to lower voltages and transported on the distribution system, which is on the right of this picture, to residential and commercial customers using the smaller poles and wires along our streets. The largest electricity customers, like factories, but also large data centers, connect directly to the transmission system so I won't focus on the distribution system today. The two biggest things on everyone's mind when we think about the whole energy system are affordability and reliability. Affordability obviously has to do with how much we pay and making sure we right-size these systems using competition or regulation to control costs and make the most out of each component, all plays a role in keeping energy costs affordable. Reliability is keeping the lights on and appliances on, and to do that involves each part of the system working correctly, having enough generators and energy storage that actually produce the electricity when it's needed, and having the grid infrastructure that can move all that electricity to customers when and where it's needed. Each of those basic components of the electricity system make up a portion of what we pay for in our electricity bills. These charts on the left show average monthly bills for a typical household using standard offer service and served by Central Maine Power, Versant in the Bangor Hydro District, and Versant again in the Maine Public District. Starting from at the bottom of each stack of the bars is the fixed charge, which is the same for all customers of that utility every month. Part of that recovers fixed distribution costs like the cost of a meter or customer service. CMP customers also pay a portion of their transmission service through a fixed monthly charge. Stranded costs are associated with certain state programs or policies and are mostly recovered through the fixed charge, but also partially through volumetric or per kilowatt hour charge. High distribution and transmission costs make up the bulk of our power bill. While not shown here, gas bills are similar in that they recover both the cost of the delivery and delivery infrastructure, as well as the cost of the gas commodity. While there have been cost increases across the different components, there is some good news in that effective July 1st, customers will see a decrease in average monthly electricity bills, including $11 a month in CMP territory, which these reductions are primarily driven by high storm costs from 2023 and 2024 rolling off our bills. The transmission system in New England generally includes large poles, wires, and substation equipment at the 345 to 34.5 kilovolt levels. And we would generally refer to the transmission system as being federally regulated by FERC, because it's FERC that reviews and approves or disapproves transmission rates, meaning how much everyone pays. However, there are other non-rate aspects of transmission infrastructure, like siting approval, which states have jurisdiction over. I'm focusing primarily on cost and rate issues in this presentation, so we won't delve too deeply into other topics, including planning, but we will hear later today from ISO New England. One of the key roles they play is to conduct or coordinate the planning of the transmission system through what's referred to as the regional system plan, as well as local area plans, which are prepared by the relevant utility. These different planning processes are important to understand because they're each focused on reliability, meaning having the necessary transmission infrastructure built out to serve customers and keep the lights on, but also because for the most part, they result in different cost recovery mechanisms. Regional transmission network costs are recovered from the 6 New England states connected to the regional grid. On the other hand, local transmission network costs, which generally serve a local utility area rather than the region as a whole, are recovered from that utility's customers. One of the important methods to ensure transmission reliability is to have redundancies in the network so that if one line is out of service, even for routine maintenance, power can flow where it's needed over a different route. Moving to electricity supply, which I mentioned is provided by competitive markets. The first important distinction to understand is between retail and wholesale markets. Retail electricity prices, including the standard offer, which about 90% of Maine households use by default, generally are a fixed price for every kilowatt hour used. Standard offer prices in Maine are determined through a competitive auction, usually conducted once a year by the Maine PUC, and the resulting price is held constant for an entire year. In contrast, the wholesale markets, where generators sell power to their retail suppliers, who then sell it to customers, are more complex in a number of ways. First, there are several markets for different products. Electricity itself is transacted in both day ahead and near real time, as well as longer-term bilateral contracts. More on that in a moment. For now, I've included this helpful simplified chart from ISO New England, which conveys that retail electricity prices are generally higher than wholesale prices, principally because they reflect a premium associated with the risks of buying electricity in a highly variable wholesale market, and then reselling it at a fixed price in the future. Actual wholesale market prices for various products can be quite volatile and at certain times exceed retail prices, which is a big part of that risk that retailers hedge. And now for more on the wholesale markets, electricity markets. That is what is driving those change. This is what is driving the cost changes over time. There have been a series of recent and ongoing changes to energy markets. There is the day-ahead and real-time markets that I mentioned. There's also a capacity market. That's the market that guarantees energy capacity to meet anticipated demand forecasted by ISO by paying generators to be able to turn on when needed. This market used to require commitment several years in advance. ISO is moving toward a prompt seasonal market. There are also markets for various ancillary services that support grid management. ISO New England oversees these markets to ensure reliability and resource adequacy across the system. There are significant costs associated with these different components, as the region also faces headwinds in building new generation for a variety of reasons, including changes in federal policies and tax structures. We remain reliant on our existing natural gas and oil generators, among other resources. Given the volatility of global petroleum markets, this reliance has led to significant price swings in Maine and the region in recent years. In terms of the market price for energy, the graph on the right shows the typical range for demand and the typical supply curve. Where demand and supply intersect is where the wholesale energy price is set at a given time. The supply curve shows in what order resources typically bid to provide energy. Resources like wind, solar, and nuclear have virtually no marginal cost, whereas gas and particularly oil units will bid higher in prices in order to recoup their fuel costs. When it comes to increasing energy demand in the region, this is the point that matters. Most of the time in New England today, gas is the marginal fuel. Higher demand, especially abrupt demand, means clearing prices increase, raising the overall wholesale energy prices in the region at that moment. This same essential dynamic plays out in capacity markets where new demand can drive up prices to induce the entry of new supply. If the region sees significant and sudden new load with no consideration for the additional capacity required to meet that load, the incremental costs will be socialized to everyone in the market, including ratepayers in Maine. Council members have already brought it up, but I would consider whether the council wants to consider recommendations for large data centers to bring their own generation. In addition, there are regional market processes the state, through various entities, should engage in to protect Maine ratepayers regarding the introduction of new large data centers in Maine. Another area that has been raised by the public and council members is if we see an abrupt increase in energy demand, there are concerns about what types of new generation will be used. Under the Federal Power Act, wholesale markets administered by ISO New England are supposed to be technology neutral. This is where state policies come in. Many states across the country, including all of the New England states, have some requirements regarding the use of renewable or clean energy. The goals of these policies include economic development, reduced environmental impact, encouraging local or domestic energy production, and more. The specifics, including definitions, percentages, and mechanisms, can vary by state, but typically electricity providers are required to obtain renewable energy certificates, or RECs, which are produced when qualified renewable generators produce electricity and is traded in competitive markets. In Maine, we have a requirement of 90% renewable energy by 2030, which includes, it's not an exhaustive list, biomass, certain waste to energy projects, wind, solar, most hydro in the region. There is also a clean energy standard that builds on the RPS to achieve 100% clean electricity by 2040. That is designed to encompass more technologies, including nuclear and large-scale hydro, as well as emerging technologies. Last year, 55% of our electricity in Maine came from renewable resources. Part of DOER's new responsibilities include the potential to use competitive solicitations to help ensure the new supply needed to meet the RPS is available. In Maine, there are generally modest exemptions in place in some circumstances for the RPS, which wouldn't necessarily be applicable to large data centers. However, a non-grid connected or islanded large data center would likely not be required to comply with the RPS today. The state also participates in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, a regional market-based effort among eastern states to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from power plants within each participating state, which has costs and benefits to Maine and other states. There are RGGI cost implications with significant abrupt new energy demand as well. In terms of takeaways, the Council could consider ensuring compliance with state clean energy laws, and as mentioned earlier, requirement around new generation could help mitigate some of these system costs as well. So during the previous meeting, we've briefly talked about how there could be benefits from new energy demand in the state. What does that really mean, and how would this work? Let's look at an electricity demand by sector in Maine over time, shown in the chart on the right. What we can see is that retail sales of electricity in Maine have trended down over the last 20 years. A lot of this is very positive, including great strides in energy efficiency and deployment of rooftop solar. However, if you look at the yellow line, you can see there has been a substantial reduction in industrial load over the years, around 50% since 2002. Generally speaking, the grid we have today was built to serve those higher levels of demand from the past. When a larger user ceases operation, the poles and wires stick around. Today, as many communities know, we have large industrial sites across the state that are now shuttered. Community-driven revitalization has been a focus for many of those communities as well as the state. One of the clearest ways Maine can reduce our households and businesses' electricity costs is to make better use of the infrastructure we already have by strategically expanding electricity usage across the state. If designed right, the more users on the system, the less everyone pays for the fixed shared costs of the electricity system. Now, clearly, there are also areas with significant constraints, so I emphasize strategically because it's about utilizing locations that have the room on the grid. This isn't just about data centers. This is a key energy affordability priority as well as an economic development priority. How and whether data centers should fit into this picture is a topic of the work of the Council. We also know that beneficial electrification for households and businesses is one of our best opportunities to lower overall energy spending. Our reliance on home heating oil and fossil fuels is costing Maine families over $6 billion every year and susceptible to volatility from global market changes like what we are seeing even this week. Beneficial electrification also means that as we reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, we will see an increase in electricity demand for our home heating and cooling and transportation. So while residents' electricity bills will increase due to increased usage, overall energy costs accounting for reduced spending on fuels are reduced. It is possible to both consistently and smoothly increase our energy demand from beneficial electrification, as well as target strategic new larger load increases at existing locations with existing headroom on the grid. The Council may want to consider whether to recommend policy approaches that support strategic energy demand increases, such as policies to support redevelopment of our underutilized infrastructure. Going a level deeper, beyond adding new demand on the grid, there are other ways to better utilize the electricity grid in which can result in energy savings or reduction in future investments needed in the system. Grid utilization is about improving the use of the grid, primarily by smoothing peak demand and focusing on increasing usage during off-peak periods. Take a look at the chart on the left. That spike illustrates a really sharp increase in demand, and the system needs to be designed and operated to meet that highest peak moment, whether it occurs 1 hour per year or every hour. If we can both increase demand in other hours and reduce that peak, we can not only avoid that high peak cost, but also spread the necessary costs across more users, as highlighted on the far right. Good market design and certain established programs can support grid utilization, including voluntary residential and commercial demand response programs that incentivize users to avoid using energy during peak times. There are additional ways that the state is also looking at grid utilization, but specifically around large data centers, it would be worthwhile to consider mechanisms that support grid utilization through load flexibility, demand response, or other strategies that could be beneficial from a cost perspective for all ratepayers. And thank you. Bringing it all together, whether and how large data centers impact electricity costs depends on multiple factors. As we've discussed, the addition of new large loads present potential challenges and opportunities. This slide identifies problems and solutions. As I hope you've gleaned from the different markets and regulatory scopes, there are multiple variables and levers to consider, all of which move somewhat independently of each other. Think back to those average bills I showed. Now, new load that better utilizes transmission might help lower transmission costs for existing ratepayers. But if it drives increased capacity costs that outweigh those savings on the supply side, most ratepayers will still pay more. It is important to be thoughtful about tying the pieces together and advocating for safeguards that consider all of the components of our energy costs. It's also important to recognize differences in jurisdiction. As you've heard previously, there are multiple entities responsible for setting policy, guiding markets, and ensuring grid reliability and ratepayer protection. I want to come back to these with all of you after we've had the benefit of the other presentations, but one of the ways we have been thinking about potential safeguards and opportunities is to focus on two buckets, state and regional. On the state side, we can look at the current requirements to make the costs of connecting new large data centers that ensure that that does not add costs to other users on the distribution system, and that they should be paying their fair share of fixed costs, including stranding costs. Today, we will hear what is happening at the PUC, and at a future meeting, we can delve into more detail regarding what the PUC learns through its process, as well as other regions and states with more data center growth and what they're doing to protect ratepayers. We also should consider how large loads can help support the electricity system if strategically located to better utilize our existing infrastructure. On the generation side, two areas of consideration are whether there should be requirements in place for data centers to bring their own generation, as well as compliance with clean energy laws. On the regional side, it's about priorities for influencing the regional and federal discussions around issues pertaining to grid reliability, transmission cost allocation, and resource adequacy. And I look forward to hearing all of your insights, additional ideas, and thoughtful approaches that the Council should consider adopting. And with that, I will turn it over to Chair Bartlett from the Maine PUC.
Good morning. It's great to be with you all. So what I'm going to try to do is to provide a pretty broad overview of some of our existing authorities, and also talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing at the regional level and the proceeding that we're having at the PUC. So you can move on to the next slide. So again, we'll cover first, I'll go over a few of the existing mechanisms that we use or we believe we have that can apply to data centers. And then we'll talk about the ongoing proceeding, just probably a very brief update because we are still early in that process. And then I'll touch briefly on the regional developments, kind of building on some of what Selena had just said. And then also just point to the fact that we have some also regulatory authority over water and gas utilities, which could implicate data centers as well. So moving on to the next slide. So there are a few areas where we have pretty clear authority over data centers and can use that authority to help make sure the costs are properly allocated. From our perspective, a key concern is making sure that to the extent any new entity is coming onto the system and imposing new costs, that those costs are appropriately allocated to them. It's sort of a basic principle of rate design is to make sure that everyone is paying kind of their fair share based on the cost of the system. So when we set rates, utilities often do what's called a marginal cost study, tend to make sure that we are keeping that up to date and that folks are appropriately contributing to the overall cost of the system. So the first place we have clear authority is the utility's terms and conditions. These are the rules of the road that the utility has to live by. So it sets the terms for all kinds of things, including rates, including interconnection costs, and so forth. Secondly, we have a CPCN process, the Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, that will apply to any large build-out. So to the extent a data center is being put in and there are significant transmission or sub-transmission level upgrades that are needed, those would come before the Commission for review. Third, we have rate design principles, which we will get into in a minute. And then finally, as I mentioned, we also have regulate water and gas utilities, and we can use that authority as necessary with respect to data centers. So moving on to the next slide, we'll start with the terms and conditions. As I mentioned, the terms and conditions are really the basic rules that the utility operates by. When a utility is formed, it develops its terms and conditions, and they come to the Public Utilities Commission for review and approval. At any time a utility wants to make a change in those terms and conditions, they also have to bring those to the commission. We can have an investigation, a process for interveners to participate and to weigh in, and then ultimately determine whether those are in the public interest. They can really address a wide range of things from, as I mentioned, sort of rates, but also things like service extensions and customer-funded facilities. For example, if significant upgrades may be needed or new poles are put in to extend service to somebody's house, there are ways that the utilities recover that from those customers, and they're laid out in the terms and conditions. There are also things like deposit requirements, construction requirements, metering requirements, and payment obligations included in those terms and conditions. So this is a really important place that we can look to make sure that costs are getting properly assigned. As it exists currently, when a large load is going to come on or any new load is coming on to the system, the utility is going to make sure that the costs are appropriately allocated, consistent with its terms and conditions. As we look forward, in this part of the proceeding that we are currently have underway, we're looking at the existing terms and conditions and how the utilities apply them and determine whether there may be any gaps. And I think particularly with respect to large loads, some things to look for, are making sure that if a new large load is coming in, make sure that those funds are provided up front so that we don't end up with stranded costs that are distributed to other ratepayers. That you can require security or deposit being posted for the same purpose. One thing that some states are doing is requiring a commitment to specific service terms. And this is if you're expecting that there could be some system upgrades that are needed, they may not be initially paid for upfront by an interconnecting customer. Having a minimum service term makes sure that even if that data center is not operating, that it's going to be paying its fair share of the cost of those upgrades. As I mentioned, you can also require payment associated with line extensions or upgrades, which are currently included in terms and conditions. And we can make sure that those adequately cover data centers. And you can also, as I mentioned, similar with a service term, have a requirement to enter into a long-term agreement for a take or pay style provision that makes sure that whether a data center is actually operating or drawing electricity from the system, they're required to contribute towards stranded costs or other costs of the system. And these are ideas that have come from other states, and we're looking at, again, whether the terms and conditions of the utilities currently are sufficient, or there are opportunities to make some changes here. And along the lines of some of what Selena said, to the extent that we want to make sure that there is sufficient flexibility, so we're not adding too much to the peak demand, that's something that could also be considered as part of a terms and condition. On to the next slide. A second important tool of review is, of course, for a CPCN proceeding. If we know that, or if a big concern that we have is that a data center is going to come in and cause huge upgrades to be incurred on the system, then the CPCN will be an important part of that process. Our certificate of public convenience and necessity is needed when there are significant investments in the transmission system or the sub-transmission system that reach a certain threshold. And those come to the commission for a review. That is a pretty thorough review that we do with the commission. We first have to determine whether there's a public need for the investment. So that includes things like economics and for the need to serve a new load, but also we look at the reliability of the system, health and safety, environmental and community impacts, state renewable goals, and we're required to undergo a non-wires alternative review to see if there is a less expensive way to accomplish the same thing. It's important to understand that a CPCN process could be required even if the interconnecting load is paying for the upgrades. So either way, if there's significant upgrades needed, it's going to come to us and there'll be an opportunity for public engagement and input in that process. We also have a role in reviewing the project scope and design, and looking at, is this kind of the lowest cost way to do this? Is this an appropriate level of investment? And I think this is particularly important if consumers could potentially be paying for those costs. And then finally, as I mentioned, there's a non-wires alternative process to look at whether there are alternative solutions that could better serve the need and better achieve other state goals and priorities. Ultimately, if we issue a CPCN, that's a decision that we find the investment to be prudent, and that the utility can proceed and know that they will be able to recover it. Now, in the case of a data center, you would expect that if these are required for a data center, that they would be customer paid. So it wouldn't be so much an issue of prudency in terms of cost, but in terms of much more of the project scope and design and the other impact issues that I mentioned. On to the next slide. A third important tool is rate design, and I think this is particularly important for ongoing costs that may not be directly attributable upfront. So, for example, if a data center is coming in and there's a new upgrade needed that's going to cost $10 million, it's easy to say, okay, the data center is paying for that upfront cost to get interconnected. But over time, there may be additional costs downstream that the system needs to be upgraded just because of the overall increase in demand on the system, which may in significant part be driven by a data center. So the rate design is the process by which we determine who pays what. So if you think about the rates of a utility, the first thing we do is have to set the revenue requirement. What is the total amount of money that a utility can recover from its customers? And then secondly, we dig into how those costs should be allocated across different customer groups. So things like how much should residential customers pay, small commercial customers, or larger industrial loads. So one way that we can make sure that data centers are paying for their fair share potentially is to create a new rate class for those data centers. So if we were concerned that there are significant, particularly at the transmission level, transmission costs that could be allocated to Maine as a result of the new load being brought on by data centers, one way to address that is to create a new data center class so that you can make sure that those costs are properly getting allocated to those customers. At the end of the day, the purpose of rate design is to make sure that every customer class is paying its appropriate share of the overall cost of the system, so that if this is done right, if a new data centers are coming on, the new cost of serving them will not be shifted to other customers. You can also use rate design to try to influence how the data centers are using the system. Selena mentioned the importance of flexible interconnections. There could be a role in a rate design mechanism to help encourage that. For large loads in general, we often use demand charges, which look at the peak demand of the customer as opposed to the overall quantity of demand in setting rates. That's important because it provides an incentive to reduce peak demand. But there are other kinds of adjustments that you can make to rate design that can encourage a much more flexible load. So it could encourage a data center to have behind the meter storage or its own generation so that it is minimizing the impact and supporting the increased grid utilization that Selena was talking about, and not driving up costs for everyone. So this is, I think, going to be an important place for us to dig in as we start to see more data centers express interest in Maine. On to the next slide. And actually, before I sort of get to this, there's another sort of tool that I haven't mentioned, which is called the special rate contract. Typically, when a large load is interconnecting to the system, they will work with the utility to design a special rate contract, which really is intended to adjust the traditional terms and conditions that would apply. So that's another place where, if that were done, it would come to the commission for our review and determination of whether it's in the public interest or not. And that could be a place, again, where costs are appropriately allocated based on the specific service that is being provided to that customer. As I think Selena had mentioned earlier, we have an ongoing proceeding at the Commission, docket 2026-142, and this was initiated in response to the governor's executive order directing DOER to work with us to identify strategies to ensure that costs are being appropriately allocated and not being shifted on to other customers, try to mitigate the risk of stranded utility assets, which would then have to be picked up by other customers, promoting the development of market and regulatory mechanisms to make sure sure that costs attributed to data center development are borne by the entities responsible for creating those costs. I think this is, I think both the interest that the legislature had expressed in addressing these issues in the executive order, I think are very timely, and I think consistent with some of the discussions we've been having at the commission over the last year about how do we dig in and make sure that we have the right terms and conditions and other tools in place to make sure that we are protecting customers effectively. The questions we're exploring in the proceeding, what are first, what is the scale of build out? Like, what are the utilities actually seeing in terms of the potential for data center development? And then how are they approaching it? How are they applying or intend to apply their terms and conditions to make sure that costs are appropriately allocated? And our hope is that as we come out of it, as we work through this proceeding, we'll identify whether there are any gaps that need to be addressed so that we can take action. I suspect that we have all the authority we need to implement any changes that would be needed. But if we identify places where we think that there is a statutory gap, where there may be a missing authority, then we would also raise that and bring it forward to this group and to the legislature as well. In terms of where we are, we've received the initial wave of comments. We had asked these questions, put a deadline in, received the initial comments, and our staff is going through them right now. And we'll consider exactly what next steps. This is an informal inquiry, so we have a lot of flexibility in terms of how to structure it, and it will likely evolve over time as we get input, as we resolve certain questions, or what often happens is new questions arise as you start digging into these issues. So because the comment deadline has just recently passed, I don't have any concrete next steps to share with you, but we will get them to you as soon as we can. My guess is in the next couple weeks, we'll be able to kind of pin down what some of the next steps in the process are. This is also important to recognize that because this is an open docket at the commission and because it's an informal process, you can comment at any time. So even though the formal comment period has closed, if there are additional comments you would like to make, you're welcome to provide them at any time and our staff will consider them. The reason we have deadlines is in order to keep the process moving and to really make sure we're getting constructive feedback that can help us build on the next steps of the proceeding. But you're always welcome to offer feedback throughout this process. And then on to the final slide. I also wanted to mention some of the regional developments that are happening. Over the last year and a half, I think we've had a lot of discussions with other states in the region. I think, as has been mentioned, one of the significant concerns about data centers is the potential impact on energy costs in the region. They could drive up a significant increase in load, could drive up capacity costs in the region, as well as just energy supply as it puts strain on our existing generation fleet. So it's important that we think not just about what's happening in Maine, but what's happening in the region, because a data center going in Massachusetts or Connecticut or New Hampshire could have a very big impact on those energy market costs. I am currently the NESCO manager for Maine. NESCO is the New England States Committee on Electricity, and it's made up of representatives from every state appointed by state governors to work together to tackle some of the regional challenges and to interact with ISO New England, to engage at FERC down in Washington, D.C., to make sure that Maine's interests are properly represented. I spent a lot of time working with DOER in that capacity to make sure that state policies are adequately being advocated for and protected in the work we're doing at Region. Recently, a couple weeks ago, FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in Washington, D.C. They oversee the bulk transmission system, kind of the interstate transmission system, as well as the wholesale markets. And ISO New England, who will be presenting next, they are our regional transmission operator, and they are regulated by FERC. FERC has recently opened a proceeding directing ISO New England and other regional transmission organizations around the country to take a look at their existing interconnection, large load interconnection procedures, determine whether there are any gaps, and to make sure that costs are being responsibly and adequately allocated, and to propose any revisions that may be needed to ISO New England's tariff within the next 60 days to try to address any gaps that exist. I think this is an important time. We're fortunate in New England that we are kind of behind the curve on data centers, that other regions have had to go through it first, so we can learn from their experience. And to have the opportunity to build a regional consensus-based approach now, before we see a huge influx of data centers, I think is going to be really valuable, and it's very well timed. NESCO recently, just last week, issued a statement just explaining that we are going to continue to work together with ISO New England, with stakeholders in the region, with our consumer advocates, to make sure that we are balancing the needs for the economic growth and benefits that can be provided by data centers with the need to insulate other ratepayers from any cost impacts from them. And again, NESCO had been doing some work on this over the last year, but we're sort of kicking into high gear now with this FERC proceeding. And then there is one final slide. As I mentioned before, well, I'm not going to go into detail here. We also regulate water and gas utilities. So as you've heard, data centers can be large consumers of water. And to the extent that they are requiring new upgrades in order to interconnect to a water system, or rates are being designed to address data centers by water systems, those issues all become before the PUC, and we have some oversight there. And similarly, if large loads are increasingly bringing their own generation, that's often going to be natural gas generation. To the extent that they are requiring new service from our gas utilities, we also have oversight and review of those as well. But I think as we are going along, we will need to continue to look for whether there are any gaps here, or ways that we may want to more holistically review data centers, taking into account sort of the cross-utility potential impact. So with that, I look forward to your questions in a little bit. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Chair Bartlett. So we're running a little behind, but we're going to just keep plowing ahead. We may make the break quite short, but let's turn now to Melissa Wynn from ISO New England to give us some overview from their perspective.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to join today's meeting. My name is Melissa Winnie. I am a lead state policy advisor on the external affairs team at ISO New England. And I'm here to provide a high-level overview of the ISO's role in and efforts currently underway to plan for potential large loads in New England. And I do think a number of these topics that I plan to discuss have been teed up very well by the previous speakers, so hopefully we can move through pretty quickly. First, on the next slide, for those who may be a bit less familiar with ISO New England, I just want to provide a brief introduction. So as Chair Bartlett mentioned, we are the regional transmission operator for the New England region, and we are regulated at the federal level by FERC, which you've heard about in the prior presentations. We also serve as the reliability coordinator under the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, and I will mention them again later in the presentation. So both FERC and NERC. We serve three critical roles for the region. We operate the high voltage transmission system, which Selena explained the difference between transmission and the distribution level. We administer the wholesale electricity markets, and we are responsible for planning, studying, analyzing the system to ensure continued reliability out to 10 years. On the next slide, it's helpful, I find, to also clarify what is out of our jurisdiction or what we don't do. So we're not involved in the retail electricity or retail rates. We also don't own any infrastructure. So the poles and wires and the generating facilities are not owned by the ISO, and those who work at the ISO are required to not have any financial stake in the companies that do own grid infrastructure and participate in our markets. Our jurisdiction also lies solely in the electricity side, so things like natural gas pipelines and oil tanks are outside of our jurisdiction. We don't have any control over siting decisions, and we also do not plan the resource mix for the region. Next slide, please. So I mentioned our planning role. So we, as part of that, we're closely monitoring potential new large loads. And when I say large loads or step loads, these are things that can include data centers or crypto mining facilities, could also be a large EV charging depot or industrial or agricultural large loads. As mentioned by the previous speakers, to date, we have not witnessed the scale of data center proposals in New England that some of the other regions in the country are experiencing. But we are preparing for the potential of large load development. We're looking at our existing processes and emerging analysis, all while focused on our responsibility to maintain reliability of the system. So on the next slide, I'll talk through some ways that we are preparing for the potential of large load additions. First, we operate in very close coordination with the region's transmission owners. So that would be like Versant Power, Central Maine Power in Maine. And we're looking at potential large load interconnections. We're seeing prospective large loads seeking to connect at the distribution system level, which we don't have as clear visibility into. And so we've worked with the TOs on a quarterly survey and follow-on discussions to help share information regarding prospective large loads. We're also closely monitoring state and local policies and regulations. So we're looking at things like moratoriums or tax incentives, siting policies, all to better understand potential implications of those policies on development of large load in the region. And we're also always researching industry best practices. We're consulting with our peer ISO and RTOs across the country, utilities. We're looking at different types of data sources and participating in relevant task forces and working groups, which I will speak to a bit more on a future slide. First, on the next slide, I know this group has heard already about our SELT forecast. So I mentioned that we're responsible for planning the regional transmission system. Specifically, we're required to look out 10 years. And in that, we provide an annual report known as our Capacity, Energy, Load, and Transmission, or SELT report. And included in that is a 10-year load forecast. So the 2026 report was just published on May 1st. And for the load forecast, we're looking at things like increased demand from adoption of electric vehicles and heat pumps, ways that load is reduced through energy efficiency investments and behind the meter solar. And from the report we released for this year, I'll mention that one key takeaway is that electrification of heating and transportation are the main drivers behind forecasted growth in the region over the next 10 years. But this year we did, among other enhancements, we did include a large load forecast, and the details of that are included on this slide. The prospective large load that we included in the forecast had to meet the requirements of being larger than 20 megawatts in total expected nameplate capacity and have entered a formal study agreement. So for this forecast cycle, we included 2 projects that equaled about 285 megawatts of nameplate, and those were located in Massachusetts and Connecticut. Neither of those projects are currently under construction, and so we excluded them from the immediate summer and winter period. So you'll see the near-term impact is minimal. Chair Bartlett mentioned consideration of these types of developments on peak demand. And so in this forecast, we saw about a 110 to 130 megawatt impact on peak demand in the 2030 to 2040 timeframe. So again, while large loads are not yet seen as a major driver in load growth in New England, we are proactively planning and establishing methodology like this large load forecast to prepare for and forecast out potential development and what those impacts would be on the regional grid. I move to the next slide. So we have our 10-year forecast that I just spoke about. I also wanted to highlight a few other efforts that are currently underway. And again, Chair Bartlett teed this one up well. So on June 18th, recently, FERC issued 6 show cause orders to regional grid operators regarding large load integration. And that is a directive for us to explain either why our existing tariff provisions remain just and reasonable or propose changes to those revisions. And the ISO and the regional transmission owners, we intend to fully comply with the directives in that order. And FERC's kind of reasoning behind issuing the order, as they stated, is to protect ratepayers, power innovation, and strengthen reliability. So there are 5 categories of reform that will be addressed in the order. They're looking at efficient study processes, cost transparency, rules around co-location, flexible load service, and generation studies. We provided an update on our plan for complying following filing with the show cause order, and I linked to the article on this slide, but we do intend to request a 90-day postponement, which must be filed by August 3rd. And if granted, that would give us the chance to hold a stakeholder process ahead of a November deadline to file. Separately, by July 20th, we've been directed to file with FERC an informational report on resource adequacy in the context of large loads. So given that this is an open order, we're actively working on it. I'm a bit limited in my ability to answer any specific questions on this. We're still in the process, but I do want to offer that we'd be happy to come back and provide updates to this group if that would be helpful. And updates will also be provided through the stakeholder processes, and those materials are posted publicly. The other effort I wanted to highlight is a NERC large load working group. So I mentioned NERC earlier. They establish and enforce reliability standards for the power system. And they established this large loads working group to develop an action plan to better understand and address potential reliability risks of emerging large loads. And the ISO is involved in this working group. NERC's also released a number of guidelines and recommendations related to ensuring grid stability as large loads are interconnected to the system. So from a resource adequacy, we're looking at reliability considerations between these two federal and regional efforts. I think I'll stop there. If folks have questions on the details of either of those when we get into the discussion, I'm happy to try to address those when they come. But you can go to the next slide. This is just a link to some resources for folks who are looking to stay up to date on our progress on these efforts. And these are active links, so you can have these once the slides are posted. And I believe that is my last slide. If you go to the next, yeah, I'm happy to speak to questions for the group when we get to that point. But thank you again for the chance to be here today.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa, and to all of our presenters. I think for time, we're going to skip break because we really want to make sure we have time for council discussion. I want to turn this back to Selena to give us just a little bit of a summary. Selena, from your perspective on what we heard to tee up our conversation. And then we are going to also drop in the chat an opportunity for the public, all of those attending our webinar, a chance to put in their clarifying questions, and we'll bring those into the clarifying questions conversation as well. So if you can drop that in the chat, and then let's turn this over to Selena to give us a bit of a summary.
Thanks, Stacy. So I think I can keep it really brief. This is just a sense of some of the areas that we've been talking about. I think Chair Bartlett really highlighted the work that he's doing and potential opportunities in the future, which I think are turn this down, Emily. All right. If you can hear me.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, my computer froze, so I'm on Apton. Sorry about that. I think we summed up most of the issues through the conversation from Phil as well as Melissa. So I think these are some of the areas for discussion, but look forward to hearing what the public has to say as well as the council members. So I'll just leave it there.
Great. Selena, did you want to recap these?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I already did on the last slide, so I'm all set. I think we're all set. We can close the slides and go on to the public poll as well as the discussion.
Great. Okay, so we've posted the link for the public. the Menti, and we can pull down the slides and just move into discussion. So the first question we have for you, council members, is about clarifying questions. Anything you would like to ask any member of the panel, from what you heard in the presentation, something you'd like to better understand. So let me open that up to you. Council members, yes. Dr. Guidaboni.
Thank you so much. So great presentations. I have a question, and I'm sorry if I missed it, if you talked about it, but in some of our previous meetings, the fact that data centers also come with the need of generators, like also black start generators, seem to be important for how that would support them, but also possibly contribute to the grid and situations where there are problems in the grid. So my question is, in situations where there are problems, I don't know, after a snowstorm or an emergency and power goes out or goes out in certain areas, how is the prioritization handled? And do the generators that come with data centers play any role?
Great. Ian, is that something you feel you can answer about black start generators?
Yeah, I'm not able to speak specifically the Black Star generators, but I will say that yeah, there are a bunch of circumstances around the country where folks are putting on lots and lots of on-site generation, and that some of that by kind of edict is required to be part of their commitment to demand flexibility. And there are certain of the hyperscalers out there who are doing more in that area and making more resource available. I do want to point out, like at the scale of some of these larger facilities, it does not take much. I mean, we're even just a few percent of curtailment really is a pretty significant bump to the resource. And hopefully this is the kind of thing that you would deploy well before you got to like a stage 3 or 4 emergency on the grid, that you would be able to have a broader safe band there with these kinds of provisions. So
Thanks, Ian. Any others of our presenters able to speak more to Black Start?
I
Yes,
had a question, if I
yeah,
could.
go ahead, Bill.
Just curious, I know with ISO and others, we're looking out at 10-year plans, but also given the state's mandate to become carbon neutral, or, our clean energy goals of 2040, weighing what that is going to look like and have any sort of impact on whether or not we can accept additional load with data centers. Is any of that being discussed or looked at?
I'm happy to take this one. Thanks for the question. So we do, as I mentioned, have a requirement to look out the 10-year forecast. But just recently, in the last couple of years, we've also established a process for longer-term transmission studies. So we are looking out 2035, 2040, 2050 for the first longer-term study that we completed, which was the 2050 transmission study. For that process, we work really closely with NESCO, that Chair Bartlett mentioned, to talk to the states and determine what types of assumptions or inputs would be most helpful to consider in those longer term studies. So we have a process in place now to look out beyond just the 10-year planning space.
Yeah. And Melissa, do you want to say something about the climate requirements? And I see we have a couple of questions from the public about this as well. Nuclear, geothermal, battery storage requirements, things like that.
I'll just jump in from a generation perspective, and in terms of our energy plan that the department is required to do every 2 years. we take a look at using the forecasts that are available and taking a look at the generation costs, the trends and how we are going to meet our long-term energy needs. Both the DOER as well as the PUC has procurement authority to help meet the future needs. And as well, the ISO also has a work required to resource adequacy, which perhaps is worth either Phil or Melissa talking about too.
Great, thanks, Selena. Do we have other questions?
Yeah, I mean, I can sort of follow up on sort of the resource adequacy. I mean, so the way that because we are a restructured state, we've essentially just allowed resource adequacy to be determined by the wholesale markets that ISO New England administers, and so that's through the capacity market is how that's usually done. I do think going forward, there's an opportunity for greater collaboration between the states and ISO New England on resource adequacy challenges, particularly given how hard it is to build things. And particularly if we are wanting to bring on some of the resources, cleaner resources, which we know have much higher capital costs and are much harder to finance through the markets.
Thanks.
Yeah, and maybe just helpful to add to that, when I talk about the planning role that we have, I mentioned a few examples of that, but it does extend beyond just the SELT forecast. So we perform needs assessments on the system, looking out at different timeframes to ensure that the grid is remaining reliable. So highlighting just a few, but there are other things that we are doing where we're looking at if there's specific areas on the grid that need to be addressed for reliability concerns. That's also a part of our work.
Great. So I want to, for time, and Erica, take your question, and also just invite council members to start to share some of your takeaways on what you are hearing as priorities, responding to what you heard from Selena's summary or from any of our presentations. But Erica, go ahead.
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts, but maybe first just a question, and I don't know if this would be Chair Bartlett or Melissa or maybe some combination, but there's some jurisdictions that are allowing tethering of data centers, and by that I mean that the generation doesn't need to be located on the same sort of footprint as the generation in jurisdictions where there is a requirement to bring your own generation, but there's flexibility around the ability to put those two things in different locations and tie them not physically, but either contractually or through other means. You're bringing your own generation, but you might put the generation in the data center somewhere else. And I'm just curious how that would work in more of the New England ISO or state context, and is that something that would even work if the tethering concept were used to enable a data center to be located in one state and the mandatory bring your own generation across a state line, or that would not really work in the construct that we have? I'm just curious on that.
I mean, I think there are probably different layers of that. So I think it partly depends on what the challenge you're trying to serve, right? When you're thinking about you needing sufficient generation to serve load, right? It's got to be you need sufficient generation able to reach the load pockets. So, for example, if you're putting a data center in one location and then putting generation in another state over, if that triggers a lot of transmission upgrades in order to get the electricity there, that seems like it's potentially problematic and may not necessarily address the reliability concerns. So I think a question is if we are truly sort of bring your own generation, thinking about circumstances where it should be closer, not necessarily on site, but does it need to be closer, like within, tied to, a similar substation, same substation or something like that. Or whether there is room in certain circumstances where, geez, there actually is plenty of generation where that data center is, and there's a constraint, and maybe putting some more generation on another kind of constraint could make sense. I think that's the kinds of conversations that we need to have both at the state level and at the regional level, and we'll need ISO's input in terms of whether that would work in terms of addressing the real potential reliability challenges and the resource adequacy challenges.
Yeah, that makes some sense to me. Thank you.
Erica, while you're speaking, would you like to jump in with some of your reflections?
Yeah, I'll try to not give you all my reflections because I have many, but I do just want to say, and I know Selena pointed out the July 1 rates were going down in CMP territory, and they're also going down in all of the Versant territories on July 1. It's around $6 per month for residential average consumer in BHD and around 2 in the Northern Territory in MPD. So just to provide some completeness on that, and I think it is a good point. I did like the part where we talked, or there was a part of the presentation around the need to protect customers from costs. And I see that in traditional ways. You would have done that through tariff design, but I would be concerned about not having enough teeth behind that. And so, if you build this new transmission for an interconnecting data center customer and they go away and you've planned that you would collect the cost of that over 10 years or whatever the term is, how do we make sure that other customers aren't stuck with that bill? And so I think there might be something that's a bit different from regular tariff structures to ensure that there's credit support there sufficient to protect customers from any costs that upfront the data center would agree to pay, but it requires on them continuing to be there to make those payments. And I think that's really important that we get that right from a commercial and credit support perspective. There's just a lot going on for me around the timelines. And I think there was just a discussion about the timelines are getting longer. And Melissa was even commenting on that in the 10-year plan. And I know on the generation side in my prior role, like we're starting to see timelines for parts, service, other things as this massive build out of the AI-based generation fleet has an uptick and an impact on, the legacy fleet, and just whether we're thinking long enough about the impacts on existing generation for their own continued reliability and ability to get parts and service and replacement and overhaul work as they're, not necessarily building new ones compared to somebody that's, I'm here to buy 5 new plants, tends to get a little bit higher service and response times from the OEMs. And so that's just maybe something for us to think about. Again, it's not Versant's area. It's just from my previous experience that things that I'm thinking about, and just to offer a perspective on how that's going to look when we need to build new generation from a wholesale market perspective. And if we're waiting for a price signal that's going to incent the new generation build, is that going to continue to be an adequate tool where the permitting times and equipment timelines are getting longer and longer? And so if you're caught in that, send the price signal to send a signal to build cycle, that cycle of potential high prices while you wait for the build response is going to be longer, in my opinion. And what do we do to address that? I think the bring your own generation concept is appropriate for what we're thinking about. And I think we heard from some of the presenters that could bring benefits to the system. I know even New Jersey and some of the other jurisdictions, including Canada, are requiring the large load that brings their own generation to be the first to shed and go offline when there are system constraints. So there can be, in addition to bringing your own generation, some things that could be designed to make sure that if somebody needs to curtail in a system emergency type of situation, that it would be those first before it would be either steady state base load customers. So there are things that we could think about in terms of what the rules or regulations into design would be for that. And then I think some of the jurisdictions are doing, I know there were some comments around clean, the bring your own. It's even created its own acronym, Beyonce, if you haven't heard that one. Bring your own new clean energy. So that's something to think about of how you would align that with what the state's goals are for clean energy going out to that 2040 timeline. the 2040 is not really that far away when you think about how long it takes to build anything. So lots going off. It's a complex topic, and I just really appreciate all the contributions of everybody. I think we'll get to the best answers by listening to all the experience and expertise of the people. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Erica. Let's turn to Jack and then to Heather.
Yeah, thanks so much. Just a couple things to mention. One which was just mentioned, which is I think the uh, a standard for bringing your own clean energy. I think we think that's very appropriate. I think if we're looking at 100% clean target in Maine by 2040, 2040 is just well within the economic life of new generation assets. And so imagining building new assets that are not in line with that 100% clean goal by 2040 seems to be really inconsistent. And so we think that that would be really a good starting point. I think also, in the slides that we saw in the last one and was mentioned today also, there's also these other implications of renewables versus fossil generation around things like water use and air pollution and other some of these other environmental issues that are maybe indirect from some of these new large loads and their electricity demand, but I think are worth considering as well that you just don't have to deal with when you're talking about renewables. Also, I think if we're allowing these new large loads to double down on gas generation, if it's in the market, you're just exacerbating this issue of gas being the marginal cost, where it really, when you get these heat waves or cold snaps, that's really as Selena mentioned, that's really the big driver. That's the wholesale market volatility crossed with the with delivering that power at a regular price to consumers. And so anything we can do to get away from those peak prices is good to do. And there doesn't seem to be much of a justification to um, to allow these new loads to come in ways that sort of are counter to those key affordability and clean energy goals. So that's something that we would support. Two other quick things that weren't mentioned, but I think are just worth putting on the table. And some of these are reflected in some comments that we made with some partners in the PUC docket. So I won't go into them in detail, but one is I think the issue around behind the meter generation and the standards for that, I think are also really important to look at. It was mentioned earlier that if there's behind the meter generation, it may not be subject to our renewable requirements, and we don't think that that's appropriate. So that would be one thing, as well as some, I think, we already have, we have industrial facilities that have behind the meter generation, and there's already a bunch of issues around our RPS interactions with the RPS and things like that. So that's something we should consider here too, as well as potentially assigning some standards for backup generation and perhaps requiring that to be non-emitting, battery storage or other things rather than diesel or other things that can have these sort of significant noise, local air, and emissions impacts. But the last thing that I think we just saw this included, or at least directionally included in a bill that was signed by the governor in New Jersey this week, is really looking at the opportunity for new large loads to look at demand flexibility, procuring demand flexibility, and aggregated distributed resources. That's not always easy to do, but I think that's something where that's an area where we're sort of headed anyway. I think as a state, as we sort of get more distributed and clean resources online, and so I think if we're able to create a pathway for these new large loads, bringing the resources they're bringing to help accelerate that, that could be really beneficial for us as a state for all the work that we're already doing. So I'll stop there. And thanks so much to everyone for all the presentations and the discussion.
Thanks, Jack. And just letting the council know, we're trying to take some notes on what we're hearing in terms of priorities and also policy ideas as you come up with them. And we'll share those out as we go. But Heather, please.
Thanks. So a few comments from the ratepayer advocate perspective. I think first, just to sort of underscore that the overarching theory and commitment, I think, needs to be that the data center causes costs, needs to pay for those costs. So the cost causer pays precept is well established in our utility regulation. I see Chair Bartlett nodding his head. And so, I think just really boiling it down, what we want to do, the overarching objective in the energy discussion here needs to be figuring out ways to draw a box around all the various types of causes of costs that are caused by any data center that might come to Maine or to New England, and put costs onto Maine ratepayers. We need to have the regulatory structures in place in advance to make sure that those costs can be cordoned off and assigned to the data centers. And that's really hard to do. I think Erica said that tariff design is a really tricky thing to get right. And there are a number of reasons why. Number one, I think Selena mentioned that if you put a data center in certain parts of the grid, that's going to improve our grid utilization in that area of the grid and could bring direct and immediate ratepayer benefits. If you put it in another part of the grid, it's going to have direct and immediate ratepayer costs that may be very difficult to cordon off using a tariff that applies generally. Tariffs are generally not site specific. And so we really need to think about how geography and existing grid capacity can be factored into those terms and conditions or regulatory decision making at both the ISO level and the local state regulatory level. The other thing that I think is really, really tough to get right and to capture in tariff language is the timeline mismatch that we're likely to face. So if a data center comes to Maine and says, we want to build at this old industrial site where there's some headroom on the grid, and we say, great, we want you to build generation to match. Well, it's going to take 5 years for that generation to be permitted and built and come online. And the data center is not asking to put their racks in 5 years. They're asking to put them in 18 months or less. And so we have a real timeline issue in terms of matching the new capacity and new energy resources and their arrival on the grid with the timeline that data centers are using for their own business planning purposes, which, as I understand it, most of these hyperscale companies don't have more than a 3-year horizon. They literally don't have a plan for what their needs are in the 4th year from today. And we literally can't plan anything that can be implemented less than 4 years from today. And so we have this real mismatch between the reality of what these folks are looking for from a business needs perspective and what our physical infrastructure is able, how fast our physical infrastructure is able to respond. And the risk and the danger there is what we've seen in PJM territory, which is that capacity market prices go bananas, and that those capacity market prices are set by a competitive market, and they're generally applicable to every ratepayer And unless we have a large load capacity market, for example, or have other ways of segregating the costs that are specifically caused and the market disruptions that are specifically caused by both the geography and the timeline mismatches, ratepayers will end up shouldering the burden, at least in the near term, and in the long term, potentially things turn themselves right side up, and data centers could be positive for ratepayers. But we have to get that near term piece right. We have to get the geography right, and we need to make sure that the transparency that we need to coordinate planning of regional system needs, local system needs, and generation resources. All those things require transparency in the planning process. And that means that data centers have to be forthcoming with regard to what their actual plans are, and not sharing those only, for example, with the utility. And then it's a black box for the rest of us in terms of understanding what the grid planning implications are. I'll stop there, but I have lots more I could say.
Great. Well, thank you, Heather, and all who have spoken up. I want to share some of what we're capturing here, particularly around initial policy ideas. You know, a number of challenges you all have, or considerations you all have named, right, around making sure that these are consistent with clean energy goals and climate goals, making sure that they are not undermining the cost for ratepayers, raising costs for ratepayers, making sure that they are not that the reliability is happening, addressing some of the questions about timeline and geography and transparency. And so I'm curious, as you all think about those, what other policy ideas or considerations do you think, right? We've captured the bring your own generation and bring your own new clean energy, demand flexibility requirements to address peaks, the requirements for compliance with RPS and clean energy, and standards for non-polluting backup generation. People mentioned factoring geography somehow into cost decisions and interconnection decisions. There's rate design considering fixed charges, time varying charges, and distinct cost allocation rules, tariff-based security, and milestone, and to make sure that there's some protection against users who come on and then disappear, special rate contracts, and as Heather had just mentioned, something about making sure transparency is happening across the board. Curious about other policy ideas or implications people want to name.
I'm just going to note with respect to the special rate contracts, and as Heather noted, that every project and every location is going to be very unique. And one of the things we might want to think about is having either, whether it's a requirement for special rate contract or some sort of a review of those interconnection agreements related to those large loads to make sure they get in front of us. Because it's the last thing you'd want is for a data center to kind of fly through, get interconnected, and then we find those costs later. And there's only so much you can put in a proactive tariff. So maybe it's at least worth thinking about whether, given that we wouldn't expect a lot of these necessarily be popping up in Maine, whether it's over a certain size, a certain potential cost impact, or some other kind of screening criteria that could then kind of force some level of review, whether it's through a special rate contract or other process.
And I had a similar thought, just to some sort of threshold in terms of when these will be required and what scale. We initially talked about definitions, but doesn't make sense and for all projects, and what total capacity we also need to consider in terms of development. The other thing that we haven't mentioned to date, and I think it's worth discussion, is that at a regional level, the conversation has really been around large load. Large loads generally, not specific to large data centers. And in Maine, we obviously have an industrial sector that's an important part of the state's economy. And so is there a distinction, and what are the ways that we should or shouldn't consider that in when making recommendations and thinking about the implications for some of our large employers in the state and what that could mean as well in terms of additional advanced manufacturing or other activities that we want to see in some locations as well.
Thanks, Lena. Other reflections, policy ideas? Brendan.
Yeah, so I just want to speak to what Selena just mentioned. I think for almost all industrial customers, they're not going to be impacted by the geographical location of compute or storage, within bandwidth limits. And so I don't really see that as a factor for the group to necessarily need to worry about. If you're worried about, is this going to impact the growth of industry in Maine? It won't. Compute's available, through data centers and the current speed of networks from southern Maine to anywhere, Boston, the Midwest, overseas, Ireland, are so fast and so, ubiquitous that, we at the Jackson Lab do a ton of work from Bar Harbor, and lots of it is in the cloud, and it's very seamless most of the time. And we're pretty far north. I don't think that's necessarily a concern.
Thanks,
I
Brendan.
just took to clarify the geography comment was more about where physically there's room in the grid. So it's a little bit more of a grid capacity comment, I believe.
I may have misunderstood, but
It was written down as geography, but I think, was that from Heather? And I think we're referring to as like the places in the grid. So physically in the grid where there might be capacity to add this without creating the need to upgrade the system because there's sort of beneficial electrification opportunity there. Is that what you meant, Heather?
yeah, she clarified in the comments. That's what she meant, Erica.
Yeah, thanks. Commissioner DeGay.
I think I'm just going to reiterate exactly what Erica had said and following up from what Heather had previously mentioned. I'm hoping we're not precluding the idea of just looking at the state in either region or geography and simply saying there's a plug and play option for some of these relative to the size of their draw or demand on the grid. So in a sense, what we might actually do is proactively look at this while we're thinking through the process and simply say, look, if they were happening or wanted to happen here where there's a community that's fully supportive and wants that type of project and it fits within the existing capacity, which interestingly enough might actually help with throughput and hopefully relief a little bit of the ratepayer issue where there are industrialized areas already that lost those legacy industries. I'm hoping we're really attuned to that and going to give that some real serious inspection.
Yeah, helpful. Okay. Any additional final suggestions or comments from the commission, and then the committee, sorry, the council, and then we're going to turn again to some public input. Okay, so this is a lot of really good ideas, considerations, policy proposals or approaches of where to be looking. As we said, the council is going to come back to this in the September meeting, really thinking about how to put this into recommendations. For now, I'd like to turn back to the Mentimeter. So, RT, if you could drop that in again. We have another question for the public to just ask how well this discussion answered your questions. So I'm going to pull my screen up for that and give you a second to add your thoughts. All right, getting a few answers in here. Let's see. Completely, mostly, somewhat. All right. So it sounds like we're somewhere in the somewhat to mostly range. So we do want to encourage people to add their questions, go to that survey, and we'll put again the link to the energy survey. It's a chance for you to add more questions that you have that we can compile and bring forward to the group. Let me turn to one more question for you, an open-ended question. What else you think will be essential to consider to protect Maine ratepayers and grid reliability? So you heard some of the ideas being discussed by the council, the considerations, the priorities, the policy ideas. So happy to hear then some from the public as well. And again, there'll be a chance to add these to survey as well. Thoughtful rate design.
If these are coming in, Stacy, I wonder if we might take a minute too to just make sure that we've heard from the council members to see if there are any other policy considerations that we want to cover, or also information. I saw in the poll that there's some information leaving. So I want to make sure before we wrap up that we have time to kind of figure out where are we and where do we need to go in future meetings. Be helpful to, I think, touch base on.
Yeah, great. Anyone from the council, additional questions, data, investigation that you think would be helpful that you want to name now, as well as additional policy suggestions?
I just wanted to note that somewhat actually might be the best possible position we can be in right now. As we're looking at these, just from an analytical standpoint, there are so many variations going back to Ian's presentation on what facilities we could possibly see being proposed and developed in Maine. There's such a wide scope. So putting in an adaptive framework that can allow us to really be able to assess feasibility going in is really, I think, our best approach, with so much variation and just facts and factors and impact, locations, geography, grid specifics that we just don't have until you have an actual proposal to evaluate. So I guess to conclude, flexibility and adaptability, I think, are key.
Yeah. Thanks, Amy. Any other reflections from the council? Emily.
I think also as we move into policies, if it is determined that there's going to be a path forward to permit data centers, we really need some large scale and statewide training for different staff that are going to be involved in reviewing these considerations, because they're intricate, detailed, and it's not going to be a one size fits all, to Amy's comment.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, considering what kind of capacity building, knowledge building is going to be needed in the on the regulatory side. All right. So I want to turn this back to Selena to just share some next steps. Oh, sorry, to Melanie, I think, to share some next steps, and maybe we can bring the presentation back up.
And also, if there are any highlights from the public comments, I think we could take a minute in addition to the presentation. We had that up for a minute, but now that it's passed, just want to make sure we haven't lost anything from that conversation as well. So feel free to chime in, Stacey, if there are pieces that you want to flag from the public. But over to you, Melanie.
Thanks, Selena and Stacey. I mean, I think amongst the notes that everybody else was taking, I think what I heard is that it's going to be really helpful for us to have an adaptive framework and flexibility, that this is not going to be a one size fits all approach. And that it sounds like there's going to be really good fodder for us to have some conversations after we have our next substantive meeting, which will be on August 13th, focused on local community impacts and economic development. So I really appreciate all the input that we've gotten from everybody. I don't want to preclude anyone from adding anything, but I know we're getting close to time. So just for the purposes of wrap up, do want to emphasize the appreciation for everybody who stuck with us for the whole meeting, particularly the members of the public. I know it feels a little bit like you're on the other side of a wall, but it truly, the information that we're getting through the surveys, through these polls, it actually is really helpful for us. It's a great way of consolidating down a lot of input into something that we can really digest and take action on. So I appreciate everybody who's been tracking the work of the council and participating. So our next meeting is going to be August 13th. That one is going to be focused on local community impacts and economic development opportunities, sort of thinking about that nexus between what we have as a charge as a council related to environmental and energy impacts and how that lands at the local level and what that means in terms of economic development. So I think some of the things that we were just talking about in terms of picking sites and identifying geographically the places where this fits in our grid and it doesn't, that's going to be a really great opportunity for us to kind of hone in on that conversation a bit more. Then, as I mentioned earlier in our meeting, we're going to be having public listening sessions after that. So with, again, the idea being we're having these pretty substantive kind of educational sessions. Hopefully those of you who are members of the public who are interested in this topic, who've been following along, are tracking all of that information as well. And so we have the same questions for the members of the public as we've had for the council members then. What are your recommendations about how we meet the charge that we have as a council in terms of developing recommendations for potential policy strategies moving forward? Looking forward to hearing from everybody on the public side during those two public listening sessions. And then after that, moving into the fall, really getting into some much more meaty discussions around formulating those kind of actionable recommendations that we're going to formulate and put into that report that we again have due in January. And just a reminder for everybody, if anyone has missed anything, we're putting everything on the council's website. All of these meetings are open to the public. Everything is being recorded. So if anyone has missed anything, if you've got friends who are wondering what's going on, send them the link. They can watch recordings of these meetings to get caught up. Really appreciate the input of everybody who's been contributing to this. And then so I think I covered most of this already. Just a reminder that if you don't want to have to do it yourself, please sign up for email updates, and then you will automatically get a notice in your email inbox when there's some additional information out there available to you. And so with that, I think we've covered pretty much anything. I don't know, Selena, if you want to have anything you want to add.
No, thank you very much. Appreciate the engagement today and really encourage people to participate in the survey that will remain open, and hope to see you all at the next upcoming meetings.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to our council members, to our presenters, to the public for being here and contributing. We will summarize all of the public input and continue to share that out both in meeting summaries and at future meetings. And we look forward to seeing you again next month.